This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes per detail.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everyone and welcome to Writers on Film. My name's John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic. Today I'm going to be talking to Matthew Asprey. He is the author of 2 books about cinema, which we'll be discussing: Mosby Confidential, Arthur Penn's Night Moves and the Rise of the Neo-Noir, and At the End of the Street in the Shadow, Orson Welles and the City. If you enjoy the podcast, please remember to like, subscribe, and spread the word as far and wide as you can. Sing it from the rooftops, if need be, or just broadcast it on ham radio if you wish. You can follow me on Twitter, Dr. Jonty, at Dr. Jonty, at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation. Sight and Sound did a issue very recently. I'm not sure if you got the opportunity to see it, but of like hidden heroes of the film industry. Mm-hmm. And I was asked to contribute any names that I felt would be, and I immediately thought, oh, Alan Sharp is an example of somebody that maybe the name doesn't ring many bells, but has contributed quite significantly to film in the last few decades. And I got a reply back saying, you're the 5th person to suggest Alan Sharp. So I was thinking, oh, maybe not that hidden to a certain group of people, certainly. And when I read your book, the thing that struck me immediately was Alan Sharp seemed to be very much your entry point into Night Moves, the book covers.
Well, I mean, what I discovered looking into the history of how Night Moves came to be made is the extent to which it really was a collaboration between the screenwriter Alan Sharp and the director Arthur Penn, and more so than maybe I initially suspected. I mean, we do always, I guess the auteur theory has been so influential, and we do tend to attribute, authorship of films to their directors, and the screenwriters do tend to get forgotten. But looking at the project, I realized, Alan Sharp really brought his own distinct vision to the genre of the detective story, and he had very specific I think, motivations for what he wanted to achieve as a screenwriter, and not just on this project, Night Moves, but on all of the films he was writing in that period. And so the more I looked into how it was made, I realized it was a collaboration. It was very much a combative collaboration. It ultimately turned out to be that way. Two artists who, were not necessarily on the same page in every respect. They had very different outlooks on things, political outlooks, I think, and just generally like attitudes towards the world. So it was a really unusual collaboration, but I definitely started to discover the extent to which Alan Sharp really was the co-author of this film with Arthur Penn. Yeah, so the book, as I started to write the book, I realized it was the story of Alan Sharp and his entry into Hollywood in the early 70s, this really remarkable arrival as a screenwriter, and in tandem with the story of Arthur Penn, who was going through his own career crisis at the same time. So I started to see the parallels in their lives, and also the very different backgrounds they were coming from, and how this sort of collided on this project. And the ironic result of the collaboration was the film, I think, is the best thing either of them worked on, even though neither of them were happy with the final result.
That was a really weird irony at the end of the book. Is you get this sense that they're. But let's not go too fast. For our listeners who maybe are not familiar with this period, shall we set the scene a little bit?
Sure.
Who was Alan Sharp, and where does Night Moves fit in his career?
Well, Alan Sharp was a Scottish writer. He was born in 1934 in Greenock, which is a town on the Clyde River. It was historically a shipbuilding town, not too far from Glasgow, where I am right now. And Sharp had grown up. I mean, he was adopted as a baby and grew up with this very stern religious family. And then ultimately he found out as a teenager that he was adopted, and this kind of set him off on this quest to discover who his real parents were. And he did contact his mother, his birth mother, but his father had died by this time. And I'm setting that background because I think it is so central to Night Moves. I mean, the whole search for the missing parent, or the parent who abandoned you. I mean, that's really the theme of the movie, I think. But anyway, he had a really strange career trajectory as a writer. I mean, he was very working class at a time when there was not a great deal of access to the mainstream media by working class people in Britain, certainly in Scotland. But he wound up actually first making his mark in British television, writing television plays and also radio plays for the BBC. And so that was his activity in the early 60s. But then he shifted his focus to writing and publishing novels. And he published 2 novels in the mid-60s. And they're very autobiographical novels about his youth in Greenock, and they're all about the town of Greenock. They're very, I mean, I'm a huge fan of his work as a screenwriter. I don't really like the novels that much. I sort of feel the novels...
You give them short shrift in the book, don't you?
I mean, they have their advocates, but... and they were very popular at the time they were published, which is maybe slightly unusual because they're very kind of experimental literary novels. I like experimental literary novels, don't get me wrong. But these ones are... I mean, to me, they're pretty dated and very much of the period. So, but what happened was, so he published these 2 novels, Green Tree and Giddy and The Wind Shifts, and they were very successful commercially as well as critically. I think because of their sex content. I mean, they're quite... It was right after Lady Chatterley's Lover had been published by Penguin. You know, the censorship trials were over. It was possible now to be much more explicit with language in fiction. And I think he kind of was just in the right place at the right time. The book that the first book he wrote sort of fit the mood. People wanted to read these, very modernist novels. I mean, it's very much, I think, indebted to Joyce and Lawrence. And so he made a big splash as a novelist, and he sold the rights to these books to all these different international markets. They were getting translated. And then at a certain point, he shifted his career focus again, which is another remarkable thing, and started writing genre screenplays on spec. So he started writing Westerns, and he started writing crime stories. And in the space of about 4 years, starting in 1971, 5 of his original screenplays were filmed, and released, all by different directors, just back to back. He wrote and saw all these projects realized, which is pretty remarkable. But he worked with directors like Robert Aldrich, who directed Ulzano's Raid. So he did work with the old guard to an extent in terms of older Hollywood directors. He worked with John Huston very briefly. And John Huston was a hero of Alan Sharp's. Alan Sharp's was schooled in the films of Huston and Bogart, as we'll see when we start to talk about Night Moves. But Huston was hired to direct The Last Run, which is a screenplay that was shot in Spain. It's about a kind of a driver for the mob, played by George C. Scott. But after about a month's shooting, Huston got fired, or he resigned, and he was replaced by Richard Fleischer. So it wasn't a very happy collaboration for Sharp. Then there were younger directors, very new Hollywood directors like Peter Fonda, who just had a huge success appearing in Easy Rider. He became enamored of a screenplay that Sharp had written called The Hired Hand. So he produced that as his first feature as a director. Yeah, so all this is going on in a very, very concentrated period of time. And, this is Hollywood in the early 70s, which is a kind of golden age for people who love the gloomier side of things. I mean, because this is a period of films where suddenly we start seeing all these movies about failure in American life. And Alan Sharp was somebody who I think pretty constitutionally was very fatalistic. He took a very bleak view of things and human relationships. He's very interested in human relationships, but the stories very rarely ended happily. In fact, in all these screenplays he was writing, it's almost, I think in every single screenplay, the lead character dies of a gunshot. It's just like it always ends unhappily. And he was just like in the right place at the right time with, tremendous talent and a tremendous gift. And he created a great deal of buzz and enthusiasm for the work that he was writing. So he had this remarkable entry into the film business, having established himself as a very successful novelist. Yeah, and he wrote westerns and crime films. And then having produced these films, the fifth of these original screenplays was what became Night Moves. And that's when Arthur Penn signed on. And, really when the deal was made to make Night Moves, the script wasn't really finished. And so they kind of had to steer it towards the final form that it had. But that's Alan Sharp. And then he did go on to a pretty successful career, and certainly financially successful career, writing television movies and working as a script doctor. And he did in later years write Rob Roy. And so he had a pretty long career, but this was just a very concentrated period in the early 70s where all of these original screenplays got made.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the career of someone like William Goldman or Robert Down or any of those big, I mean, numerically, the actual number of screenplays that they produce and actually get on the screen are not that many, nowhere near the number that a productive director will get made.
I think, working screenwriters in Hollywood always wind up writing about 3 or 4 times as many scripts as actually get produced. And that's certainly true of Alan Sharp as well. I mean, it's in the scheme of things, it's not that expensive to commission a writer to write a script, but it's a lot more difficult to get the money to actually produce a film. And so, yeah, I mean, Sharp, there are a lot of unfilmed screenplays in the Sharp archives. So he was a consistently working screenwriter for his whole career. And he, as I said, he wrote a lot of TV movies, and that's a very sort of disposable, ephemeral format to work in, the movie of the week on TV. But so he did have a consistent career over a long period, but it was really the first half of the 70s where we got all these original Sharp films made.
What about that shift that you sort of alluded to as well? I mean, he shifts from being a novelist to a screenwriter, which is one thing, but he doesn't write screenplays about, Greenock. He writes screenplays that are aware, and I've seen Ulzano's Raid and The Hired Hand. And if nobody told you this screenwriter's a Scottish writer, you'd never guess it. they master the idiom. You know,
well, he said, I mean, I think there's some truth in the fact that Hollywood and American culture is a pretty international culture. He'd grown up in Scotland, going to the movies all the time and seeing these Bogart films and seeing Westerns, the films of John Ford and so on. So he felt, I think, very fluent in that language, that cultural language. And for him, I mean, he said, growing up where he had grown up, not the most, exciting place in the world and pretty gloomy at times and kind of poverty, that the films that he saw as a child kind of gave him a sense of grandeur that didn't exist in his own life. So, but I think it was the best decision he could have made to begin writing these Hollywood genre screenplays because, I mean, he obviously had a very autobiographical impulse as a novelist and, writing about his hometown. And, he had a very complicated personal life as well, romantic life. And he wanted to get, I think, a lot of that on the page. But by writing genre screenplays, I think it was, apart from the fact that I think he played to his strengths. I mean, he wrote great dialogue. He wrote very taut action sequences. And, he was very good at structuring his screenplays. And it meant that the kind of purple prose that he specialized in as a novelist just had to go out the window. So I think he was playing to his strengths, but also by removing himself a little bit from this nakedly autobiographical content, it still allowed him to explore the themes that he was interested in about men and women and so on, but in a sort of different context. And I think that all was very beneficial, and his writing suddenly kind of came alive.
Yeah, kind of tragic masculinity, romantic masculinity,
That's it. I mean, he was somebody, I think, he was very interested in masculinity. He was very interested in the limits of the male experience, and he's very interested in women. And I don't just mean romantically interested in women. He was interested in women, as people. And in fact, when in the process of researching my book and I interviewed the actresses who'd worked on Night Moves, they were both, the two main actresses were both, they remembered being so impressed by his insight as a male writer into the female experience, and that he wrote female characters which were very unconventional for that time. So they were extremely excited to work on the project because you didn't see that type of writing for women actors too much.
And so moving on to Arthur Penn, Penn at this point has already established himself as both a TV and film director, and also on Broadway, I think. He's already done Bonnie and Clyde. Before that, he did The Left-Handed Gun with Paul Newman. So where is he? At what point is he in his career now that Night Moves comes along?
Well, Penn, should have been kind of at the top of the world. I mean, as you say, he'd had a career directing TV in New York, and then he'd come to Hollywood, and, he made a bunch of films in the late 50s through the 60s, but, really culminating in Bonnie and Clyde, which, was a major film in the culture. I mean, it was a very new type of film in terms of its depiction of violence, but it was an exciting film. It seemed to take on board the influence of the French New Wave, so it definitely seemed to represent a new type of film. But the thing is, actually, Penn at this particular point, that when he took on the Night Moves project, personally, according to the interviews that he gave, and he was in a very dark place. He was, I think, suffering from pretty serious depression at one point. He directed Little Big Man in 1970, which was a kind of revisionist Western with Dustin Hoffman, and I think he found that whole process very exhausting. But more than anything, I think politically, and he was very closely aligned with the Civil Rights Movement and Democratic Party. I think the Kennedy assassinations had been very traumatic, and he'd known both the Kennedy brothers. And so I think there was a kind of culmination of just traumatic experiences, and even, I think, more directly traumatic was the fact that he was in Munich in 1972 at the Olympics making a documentary when the terrorist incident occurred where the Israeli athletes were murdered, and he was like right in the middle of all that, that experience. So I think it was just a kind of mounting traumatic experiences for him. So he went into a pretty dark place, and hadn't really worked on a feature after Little Big Man, up until he took on board Night Moves, he really hadn't worked except on that documentary about the Olympics. So he was, he kind of been out of it a little while. I think he was spending time with his family and teaching. But so this was kind of a return to active filmmaking for him when he took on the Night Moves project. But yeah.
The sort of the third figure as well that you sort of mention as you sort of build up at the very beginning of the book is Gene Hackman, who obviously is the star of the film. If star is the right word for someone like Gene Hackman, because he's such it seems slightly antithetical to his persona, the idea of star. How did he get on board, and how important was his contribution here?
Well, I mean, he'd worked with Penn on Bonnie and Clyde. He had a supporting role in Bonnie and Clyde, and that had actually been the film which had made him into a name as a character actor, I think. But then he did The French Connection in 1971, which, won him an Oscar, and he became a leading man, a big star. And so he was really a bankable star at this point, even though, as you say, he was not in any way the kind of conventional Steve McQueen or Paul Newman type star. He was really a character actor who had been elevated into that leading man status, a really truly great actor. So I presume that I don't know the exact details of how Hackman got the role, but I presume he had this established association with Penn. I don't think it was something that Sharp expected, that casting, but it worked out being just a tremendously good choice for this role. Particularly, it's a character. The character in Night Moves is a kind of macho football player, somebody who very old-fashioned in his mentality in many ways, and but he's got a lot of inner turmoil, and Hackman's speciality is just he's able to communicate, I guess, a kind of emotional turmoil without having to really do anything very overt. There's just so much going on inside that's evident to the viewer, and so he was a very quiet actor in many ways, and so it was just perfect casting, I think, for this very complicated role.
Yeah, he just has one of those faces that even at rest seems to tell you everything you need to know. So he can do an absolute minimum and still convey very complex states of mind, as you said. And what about you? How did you? So we've got Hackman, we've got Penn, we've got Sharp. How did you get to Night Moves? What was the move that got you? Which, by the way, you pointed out it was called originally something like, what is it, the Dark Tower, or
the Dark Tower? Yeah, that was the title actually until, post-production when I think the reason the title got changed was in 1974, The Towering Inferno was released. And I think it was an attempt to they didn't want any sort of name confusion involved. So they renamed it Night Moves with the pun on night. Yeah, how did I get involved? Well, I'd just written a book about Orson Welles, which I think we want to talk about. But, having done this very big project where I had to kind of take on board the entire filmography of Welles, I thought, well, it'd be nice to do a kind of more restricted research project, like focus on one film. And Night Moves was a film that I had seen several times, and every time I saw it, I got more intrigued by it. It seemed to be more resonant. And I don't think I'm alone in that's, I guess, reaction to it. It seems to be something that kind of lingers in the memory, and you start to get I started to get a little sort of obsessed with it and try to figure out, well, exactly why is this film so compelling? But also it hadn't really been, the making of the film wasn't really that well known. And the film itself was only really restricted to a cult audience, and maybe still is. But so I started looking into the background, and I read an interview with Alan Sharp, actually. And I think that was the catalyst to actually do the book, because I found this interview with Sharp so compelling and full of insights into the writing process and the filmmaking process. And, I was so impressed by his particular angle on the subjects, the themes of this story. So I guess in a way, the book was an attempt to kind of explore all of the provocative things that he had said and sort of take them further. So and then I also just realized it's a really good story, how this film came to be made, and the weird circumstance that neither the writer nor the director were happy with the way it turned out, even if I think it's their best work on either side.
Yeah, and it's also become quite recognized in critical circles as one of those classics of 70s cinema that to stand up beside The Conversation or Parallax View or any of those other sort of grandees. I mean, my first experience, my first knowledge of the film came from reading a book. I forget the name of the author now. Maybe you can help me out. It's The Cinema of Loneliness.
Yeah.
Is it Kolker?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And it's a survey of, I think, 6 sort of 70s directors, including Kubrick, Penn, Scorsese, and all the way through. It was, I read about it before I saw it, and I read about it very much in the context of this is an American new cinema, and it's influenced by the new wave and Mickey One and things like that. So when I actually sat down and saw it, I was primed to sort of take it seriously, I suppose. But I also just really enjoyed it as a really good piece of genre filmmaking.
Mm-hmm. It is very much in line with those other films you mentioned. It's about, as you say, that's a good term to use in relation to. It's about loneliness. It's about this inability of this main character to communicate with his wife he's trying to. And yeah, there was this period when it was possible to explore these themes in a way that they didn't have to resolve in any sort of traditionally satisfactory way. And I mean, that's certainly true of Night Moves. There's a lot of unresolved questions about the film, but it is a genre film, and it was released as a genre film, and I think that's one reason why it never really made a big splash initially, because people expect certain things out of a piece of genre like Night Moves. They expect it to tick the boxes for a private detective film, which it doesn't entirely do. And
it doesn't have a bullet style car chase or
no,
or a sort of set piece but these sort of detective movies seem to be really popular at the time, and not popular popular more with directors maybe than with audiences, in the sense that you mentioned as well in the book that you've got the Long Goodbye and Chinatown. I think it's a way that history concertinas as well, because we think of the 70s as extremely separate from the 40s and the 50s and film noir, but they're only, it's only 20 years separate 1970 from 1950, and it's Bogart isn't dead for that long. I think one of the things I found great in the book is you just list James Dean died this year, Marilyn Monroe this year, Humphrey Bogart was maybe the first to go. And you just sort of think, yeah, God, that's the equivalent of us losing David Bowie and, one after the other. How strange that must have been at the time as well.
Yeah, I know. It wasn't that long, but not many years had passed. However, I think American sensibility had entirely changed, and culture had entirely changed in the 60s. And I mean, you look at American Graffiti, which is released in 73, and it's about 1962. And so it's a period film about only 9 years earlier. So the equivalent, we're talking in 2021. It's not, it's like what was happening back, in 2012. Not much different, you would think. Maybe it was a lot different. But I think there was this sense of, America had transformed, and in every way. And there was a lot of nostalgia for the past, which was manifesting itself in a lot of films being made, like Last Picture Show and American Graffiti and The Sting and The Way We Were. And so all these films are coming out in the early 70s, either period films or films like What's Up, Doc, another Bogdanovich film, which is, screwball comedy, 30s style comedy. So it was, I think partly that was the affection that was present in that time for movies of the golden age of Hollywood was a result of television, because suddenly old movies were on TV. Like what had been a very ephemeral thing was suddenly, you can go and watch old Bogart movies again on TV. And so there was this growing fondness in the among the American public for old movies. Because they were suddenly accessible again. And the detective films that started to emerge in the 70s, really in the late 60s and into the 70s, a lot of them are kind of pastiche films. They're very, they're winking at you. Look at us do the old Bogart number. And, some of the lesser detective films of the 70s, I think, are very much just kind of nostalgia exercises. Like Farewell, My Lovely came out around the same time as Night Moves, and with Robert Mitchum. And it's very much, I mean, it's not a bad film, but it's not anything particularly profound, because it's all about just aping the style of those movies, the visual iconography, the fedoras, the trench coats, and people obviously took a lot of pleasure. The audiences took a lot of pleasure in seeing contemporary revivals of that old style,
and even seeing Robert Mitchum again.
Exactly.
It's Burt Lancaster would do a similar thing in Atlantic City to maybe a bit more depressing effect.
Because it wasn't as if so much time had passed that those actors were not still around. I mean, most of the 40s actors were still alive and still many cases working. So it was easy to get a Mitchum to do that. There's other interesting detective films like Chinatown, which sort of starts as a pastiche of the old detective story, but then it becomes something much greater than that. I mean, I think, this is something it had in common with Night Moves and The Long Goodbye. You sort of begin the movie and it's like, okay, this is a kind of nostalgic genre exercise. Let's enjoy the pastiche qualities of this detective film. But then it actually winds up making the case that no, this genre is actually a very valid genre to explore issues in the contemporary world. I mean, obviously Chinatown's set in the 30s, but I think it is in many ways also about the era of Watergate, and so, the detective films kind of had made a comeback, and Night Moves is in the middle of that, but I don't think it satisfied the people who wanted to have a nostalgic good time. And more than anything, I think, timing is so central to the success of any film. Night Moves came out in the summer of 75. It's always, people bring up the fact that it came out within a few weeks of Jaws, and Jaws was the biggest film of all time and a very different kind of movie. But I also think the fact that it came out right around the same time as two other Gene Hackman movies, French Connection 2 came out the same summer, as did his Western Bite the Bullet. And so if you're a Gene Hackman fan and you're looking at what's on at the cinema, you have other options. And I think Night Moves kind of just fell through the cracks. The reviews were not that great, because I think it really is a film that gains so much on the second, third, or 20th viewing. And
20th in your case.
I haven't counted, but it's been a few times.
I imagine.
So it's one of those films that, and you mentioned also films like Parallax View and The Conversation. I think The Conversation, although it was well reviewed and did well at Cannes, that was not really celebrated as one of the great films of the period at the time. I mean, Godfather was, and Godfather 2, but a lot of the films we are now looking at more with that celebration from that period. At the time, there were so many films being released, and they just kind of came and went in many cases, So, and Night Moves was one of them. Yeah.
My perception of The Conversation was the idea that it was kind of almost like what Coppola doing one for himself. He'd done, The Godfather for the studio, and he got The Conversation, then Godfather Part 2, and then Apocalypse Now was a sort of mix of one for himself, one for the studio. But I absolutely accept that. It has definitely taken a complete revaluation, I think. Not that it was ever hated, just that it was, as you say, it was just this small film, this sort of oddity. The figure of the detective kind of changes as well, and I think one of the things that's interesting with Gene Hackman in Night Moves is that, and maybe I was wondering whether this might have something to do with it not fulfilling all those generic expectations.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
I remember Harrison Ford criticizing Blade Runner because I play a detective who does no detecting, and sort of Gene Hackman himself in Night Moves says, I didn't solve anything. It fell on top of me. Do you think that idea of a detective as a sort of a powerful male, well, the knight of the title, as you say, sort of being reduced to this kind of victim of circumstance?
I think that was Sharp's interest in writing this film, and one of the reasons why the outcome was a bit contentious between him and Penn. But I mean, Sharp, he loved Bogart films, and Bogart had, in Maltese Falcon and Big Sleep, established on screen the kind of model of the masterful detective who was a kind of macho and who was always in control of every situation and then solved the case. It's sort of like this model of the hero. I think Bogart certainly had introduced this new type of screen hero with Sam Spade in Maltese Falcon. And although Sharp loved those movies, I think when he came to write his own detective story in the 70s, he was very interested in kind of probing and interrogating the limitations of that kind of hero. And that's really in all of his screenplays of the early 70s. He was really interested in breaking down that male hero and looking at the limitations. So in his screenplay for Night Moves, the main character he was an ex-football player. He's a homophobe, and that was an aspect of the script that was toned down quite significantly by the final cut. And he acts essentially as a Bogart style private detective hero. He goes around being kind of aggressively masculine, and he also falls in with the stunt director, who's this, like him, a kind of macho guy, uses his fists before his brain. And I think Sharp's intention was to show that understanding of the world, that understanding of men and women, was very limiting, that the world was a much more complicated place than, the Maltese Falcon would indicate. And so the fact that Harry Mosby's wife is cheating on him with this guy who, isn't kind of clearly an intellectual, he's also somebody physically very unimposing. He's a guy who walks with a cane. I mean, I think this totally pulls the rug out from underneath Mosby. He cannot understand how that could be the case. How this woman has left him, who's a very kind of aggressively physical guy, for somebody he doesn't understand. And he finds that very, very threatening. And that's, I think, that was Sharp's intention. He wanted to show that, you can't really be in the world in that way anymore and expect everything to work out. So that's why Mosby winds up not solving this case. He's kind of totally befuddled by what he discovers. So Sharp was very much interested in pointing out the limitations of that kind of masculine hero. The film pulls back a little bit from that criticism for several reasons. I think partly the casting of Hackman, as great as it is, I don't know necessarily that was exactly what Sharp had in mind for the character. I think he was thinking of a more simplistic kind of macho hero. And Hackman, because he has so much obvious sensitivity, even if it's not expressed, it makes for a great performance, but maybe it blunts a little bit what Sharp was intending to get across. And also the fact that Penn, in the editing, he did make the film and cut it so that these negative qualities of Mosby were very evident. But, then he's, according to Sharp, Penn sort of chickened out at the last hurdle and started to maybe pull certain things out. As I said, there were the homophobia of the main character was more pronounced, and that a lot of that was kind of cut back because they tried to make Mosby into a more sympathetic and less sort of just bluntly macho kind of meathead character. I think that was all to the good. I think what we wound up with is an excellent film. I think Sharp was going for something quite extreme. He really wanted to kind of break apart the genre and all of the kind of founding myths of the detective story. But and Penn had his own sensitivity and sort of managed to kind of find a way to bring back some of the extreme elements and humanize it actually a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, I get the feeling that Penn, as a director of drama, had always had his eyes on allowing the audience to have a finger hold on the character and not just make someone who's so dislikable that people end up going, well, I don't care what happens to this guy.
Yeah. I mean, Hackman had played, he was one of those great actors who could play a really pretty bad character, like pretty bad guy, and you'd still be on his side. I mean, French Connection. I mean, Popeye Doyle is, he's overtly racist, and he was kind of a thug. There's no doubt about that. But Hackman's so charismatic that you don't care. You'll follow him. But so it's kind of a matter of trade-offs in the editing room, I think, trying to find the right balance. And Sharp was, I think, disappointed because he wanted to make a pretty extreme statement, and Penn ultimately decided to go a slightly different way.
I saw Hackman in a Western with Oliver Reed and
A Hunting Party.
That's right, yeah. And he plays a ferocious misogynist in that. So I don't get the feeling that it was anything in Hackman sort of wanting to protect his reputation or anything in terms of how some actors might have done. Some actors might have said, this is too dark for me. Or
according to Sharp, I mean, Penn showed a rough cut of the film to his friends in Hollywood and to guys like Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty and I think Terrence Malick was there, and Robert Towne, I think, was there, who'd written Chinatown. And their response was, you got to tweak this because the character's so unlikable. And Penn ultimately decided that advice was good. And I'm, of course, this is Sharp's telling of this scenario, and Penn didn't really speak about it, the decision making. But Sharp, I think, sort of felt like Penn had gone and hung out with his macho friends, and they were all kind of offended by the film, so they told him to change it, and he kind of went along with that. But yeah, I mean, that's Sharp side of the story, and I don't know that that's the full story.
Yeah, and you made that clear. But I mean, I suppose like the end of Night Moves, where you're not quite sure what the conclusion is, but it's very far from a happy ending. That reflects the sort of ending of the production of the movie as well, with this sort of sense of uncertainty and people walking away not particularly happy with what they've done, even though, as you say, it's something of a modern classic.
It's not a happy ending. That's the thing. I mean, nobody's going to walk out of Night Moves thinking, wow, that's affirmed all my prejudices about the world. I mean, I think it's very provocative. It's a really dark film. But I mean, Sharp wanted it darker, and I mean, there's little things changed. Like you may remember towards the end of the film, there's a fist fight between Hackman and the guy down in the Keys, and it's very bloody kind of fist fight. I mean, in the script, that guy dies from his injuries in the fight, and if you look closely at the scene as it's edited, there's a line dubbed. Jennifer Warren dubs a line which basically says he's still breathing, he's okay. And in the film, the original idea was that this guy died from that. But clearly in the editing room, they're like, oh, this is so, can't we just like have him injured and just lying there unconscious? Because it's just unrelentingly horrible.
He's beaten a man to death, and the man isn't the main villain,
there's lots of little things like that. And I think it's actually really well done, this last-minute surgery. I mean, and that's probably due to the expertise of Dede Allen, who was the editor, such a brilliant collaborator for Penn. It shows you how you cut one line here and there, and it does transform the meaning of the film, or it transforms how we understand a character.
Yeah, there was a lot of ADR done on Once Upon a Time in America as well, the infamous sort of police academy cut that they made of the film. And they would have sort of people saying, we're going to so-and-so's to pick up so-and-so as a way of sort of clearing up what they thought was Leone's inept filmmaking. Yeah, what an amateur that Italian is. Sergio Leone doesn't know how to tell a story. Listen, let's move from Night Moves to your first book, which is Orson Welles. Sorry, can you give me the full title?
It's a mouthful. It's at the end of the street in the shadow. Orson Welles in the city.
Okay, so I'm not sure if there's an adjective for this. Wellesian. I'm a huge Orson Welles fan, and full disclosure, I haven't read your whole book. I've read your introduction and the first chapter, but I'm definitely going to stick with it because it's a really original look at Welles. What led you to this? Was this are you approaching film via academia? Then are you looking at it as an academic?
Well, I am. I mean, I'm an academic, and that's my background. And I guess as a Wells researcher, that's certainly how I started. And it is an academic book. I mean, I feel more now that I'm approaching film writing as a historian, and I mean as a critic as well, but less in a less sort of, I guess, directly academic way. But the Wells book was the product of my own huge enthusiasm for Wells, and the fact that the more you look, the more you discover. And more than anything, the excitement of going into the archives and looking at the huge mountains of paper that he left behind, the unmade screenplays and all the documentation, the sketches. So, yeah, I mean, I approached the book. It's a study of his body of work. So it is, I mean, there's quite a number of books out there that look at the films of Orson Welles, of course. But I decided to look at him as an urban filmmaker. I thought he was a great kind of poet of the city. And so that's the sort of prism through which I decided to look at his body of work. And, I mean, he made films all over the world, in many different cities. And sometimes he created the cities in the studios. But I think he had a lot to say about urban life and, not just in the 20th century, but in the past as well. So it kind of just created a guiding structure to explore his work from a different angle.
I love the idea that you mentioned right at the beginning of the book, where he traveled so much as a teenager with his father, and so he'd seen a lot of these cities already. So it was almost that whenever he went to visit a place as an adult, there was always a sense of nostalgia. He was always going back to a place he'd already been to. It's sort of the limits of being precocious, I guess, is from then on, you're just bored. You're just retreading.
Yeah, it was always like, wow, Budapest was over by 1923, so that was kind of a bit like, and he'd been there. Yeah, that's, he had this remarkable childhood because he did travel all around and was just a sponge. So, when he went to a place, he read everything he could about it. He read the literature of the place, and he read the history of the place and connected with it. So he was an incredibly cosmopolitan artist. So yeah, by the time, I mean, he made Magnificent Ambersons when he was 26. And, that's a film all about, I mean, it's from the point of view of the nostalgist, the way things had used to be in the old days, which is a weird thing for a 25-year-old to be obsessed with. But I think that was just his sensibility. And it kind of creates this emotional logic for the characters, this sense of there had been a past where things had been better, I think he used that very artistically.
I mean, even Citizen Kane, you have you're looking back on the life of a man, where did it all go wrong?
Rosebud is just an object that expresses nostalgia for something that's vanished. Yeah, that's why his films are so, I think, so moving at times. I mean, Chimes at Midnight is even more so a film about. He was very interested in how one historical era is kind of succeeded by a later one, and he is interested in those characters who kind of are rendered obsolete by transformation. So that's the Magnificent Ambersons. These old kind of aristocratic town folk who are just totally left behind by the March of Progress. And Chimes at Midnight is all about Falstaff going through the same thing. He's somebody of the Middle Ages who suddenly finds himself in this, new era where things are much colder and less organic. And, he found great poetry in that transformation. And I think my interest in urban images in Wells' films is he found ways to explore how cities change and how that affects our lives.
How did you originally sort of land on Wells? What was your first sort of experience of Planet Wells?
I mean, as a teenager, I got interested in Wells, the old-fashioned way of seeing Citizen Kane and Ambersons, and I saw Journey into Fear pretty early and on television, and just being like, wow, this is great stuff. And I wasn't thinking about writing a book about his work at that time, but I just got very enthused by Wells. And I think I also became, the whole story of Ambersons and the fact that it had been butchered by the studio and how he was a kind of martyr for all those artists, he representative of all those artists who'd struggled for freedom of expression. I found that very romantic. But then weirdly, I actually saw F for Fake very early as well, which was at the time a film that was not really out there and not very accessible. It was on television in Australia in the 90s. And so that kind of, I equally loved that, but I was also astonished this is the same director. Because it's so different to those earlier films. And then I saw the Touch of Evil restoration when that was put out in the late 90s in the cinema. And again, it's just every time I saw a new Welles film, it was like, well, so there's so many sides to this artist. And so that was just an enthusiasm as a teenager and in my early 20s. And then when I ended up doing a PhD, a chapter of my thesis was on Touch of Evil, and it kind of just grew from there, this interest. And I was always so fascinated by the unreleased films, the unfinished films, this idea that, okay, we've got a kind of glimpse of the surface of his work in the films that have been released, but clearly there's so much more kind of in the shadows behind him. And so when I finally got to the archives in the US and also in Europe, it was like entering Xanadu and poking through all the objects that were left behind.
What did you discover your personal rosebud in that?
There's a lot of rosebuds in there. It's well, that's the other thing. I ultimately come to specialize in looking at his unmade screenplays, right? Because there's dozens and dozens of scripts that he wrote for films that was never able to get the money to make. And, some of them have been looked at pretty extensively, but there's a lot of others that nobody has ever really looked at in any depth. And, they're kind of the undiscovered country for me. So
you would think there would be like a collected edition of Welles's writing. From screenplays to essays to journalism, like a proper authoritative.
Yeah. Lots of stuff has been published, but still it's only a very small proportion of all that exists. But there's lots of practical challenges to that. Firstly, legal issues. Ownership of some of these screenplays, is pretty questionable. And there's been some unmade screenplays have been published. The Big Brass Ring was published, and Cradle Will Rock. But there's lots and lots of stuff there. I think we're going to get a steady stream of Welles material appearing for the foreseeable future, because the interest is clearly just growing more and more, and there's no shortage of it.
I talked to Mark Cousins a couple of years ago when he released his documentary, The Eyes of Orson Welles, and he was kind of saying that there was a period where there was a sort of dip in interest in Welles, that it was sort of maybe the propaganda that he sort of wasted his talent and was kind of winning. And it became almost fashionable to sort of disparage his work. But then it's, the backlash to the backlash has arrived. And we had his documentary. We've had The Other Side of the Wind was released and is on Netflix at the moment. What did you think of that, by the way? What did you think of The Other Side of the Wind?
I'm extremely happy that this happened, because, anybody who's been into Welles for years, this has been this sort of legend. So firstly, just to say, the fact that it actually was achieved, I think, is remarkable, considering all of the challenges of that. But looking at it as a film, I've watched it quite a lot of times. I've seen it quite a lot of times lately, because I'm teaching Welles at the moment online. And so I have to keep coming back to these films. And the more I see The Other Side of the Wind, it makes sense in the context of Welles' body of work, and it really was a missing piece, I think. I have my quibbles with certain aspects of how it was put together. I think it's a little bit too long. I think 10 minutes could be taken out of it. I won't speculate on what Welles would have done, because you can't really know. But I honestly think it's a real great achievement that this occurred, and I think it's a really, I don't know if I'll say a great film on par with the best of his work, but I certainly think it's a very worthy addition to the filmography. So I was just ecstatic that this got done, and I think the intentions of the people who reconstructed it were very honorable. So
I had the opportunity to watch it at Venice when it was premiered. Wow. You could imagine the trepidation in that screening room, because there were, it was a risky business. It's, is this going to actually detract from his reputation rather than? And I was just very pleased that it was recognizably a film.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that was a given, because I've seen a lot of sort of, as you say, a lot of for instance, there's a new sort of documentary called Hopper Wells. I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to see that.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that is kind of not really a film, if you know what I mean. It's you're kind of watching B-roll, and it's fascinating and interesting. And for the completist, yes, definitely watch it. But if somebody's sitting down and they don't know much about the context or anything like that, it's just not a film in that sense, I don't think.
No, I was a bit, I objected a little bit to this whole directed by Orson Welles credit. I think a better credit would be something like From the Orson Welles Archives, because it is just fragments of, it's takes, well, they're just improvising, and there's this blurry line between an actual conversation that Welles and Hopper are having and Welles getting into the main character of The Other Side of the Wind and provoking that Dennis Hopper. And I think Hopper's making up a lot of stuff at times as well. So it's very interesting. But Other Side of the Wind, it was a big leap of faith. And I'd read the screenplay and I'd seen various fragments. And to be honest, I never really got it. And I had the idea that, Welles is at his best, I think, on film when he's adapting an existing literary source. I think he was just so masterful at writing adaptations of existing works. But his original scripts, there's not too many of them. Mr. Arkadin was an original script. Big Brass Ring was. But there's not too many of them. And I don't really think that was his best mode, because I think there's certain dramatic failings or limitations to his own original scripts. Even Citizen Kane was obviously a collaborative work. I think he worked really well when he had to rewrite something.
No, wait a second. Citizen Kane was written entirely by Mank. Entirely by Mank, according to...
That's what they say. Well, knowing Welles, I don't think he would have just shot a Mank screenplay. I'll just say that. But no, that's been put to bed long ago. Yeah. But he was great at rewriting things and tweaking things. And Touch of Evil, for example, I think is an amazing example of taking a not very good screenplay and a not very good novel and just transforming it into this totally brilliant piece of writing. But yeah, so I was a bit hesitant about The Other Side of the Wind. I read it and I was like, I don't quite get what he's trying to achieve with this screenplay. I don't really understand it. And then seeing how it was put together, I actually realized, okay, it does work. His instincts were very good. I do think there is a sort of limit, a dramatic sort of limitation to the film, because not that much really happens dramatically throughout the film. It's very sort of episodic in its structure. But, that's one criticism. But I think in many other ways, it's a really good film. What did you think of it?
I was really relieved, and I thought this is good enough to be there, to be out there, and in many ways you can't really ask for anything more from an archive, from something that's been put together essentially posthumously. I did think that it sort of suffered from. I think, as you were saying, Welles is best when he's doing an adaptation. I also think he's best when he is inhabiting a genre. And this was a really contemporary film about, an Antonioni sort of, an argument that he seemed to be having with Michelangelo Antonioni. And so there was a sense of sort of irrelevance. I kind of know what he's getting at because I've seen Antonioni's films and all the rest of it. But what, if it had been released at the time, might have seemed a real, oh, wow, have you seen the new Welles? He really goes after Antonioni. These days, it's just like...
who cares?
Yeah, exactly. It's a crazy guy out in the desert,
But then, we can... you're right. Over time, films take on new meanings, and we look at different aspects of the films as time passes. And for me, we're still a little bogged down in the story of how this film was made or not made, the biographical aspects of the autobiographical aspects of it, because people are always trying to, even the documentary that accompanied The Other Side of the Wind on Netflix was basically, they're saying, oh, this is Welles talking about himself. And maybe that's true to some extent. I can see it. There's very obvious autobiographical parallels, but at the same time, I think all that distracts us a little bit from thinking about this as a film. We maybe haven't gotten quite to the point where we can divorce all that baggage from just considering the film itself. And and my interest in that film, one of my main interests in the film is the fact that, Wells is dealing with the whole question of masculinity in this film.
Yes.
And I've written about that. I looked quite closely into the Hemingway aspects, the Hemingway influence on this, which I still don't really think has been looked at in more than a kind of superficial way. But yes, as I'm interested in Alan Sharp's explorations of masculinity in the 70s, I think Wells was doing the same thing. And, that main character, okay, there may be some obvious autobiographical parallels to Wells' particular position in Hollywood at that time. But more than anything, he was very interested in the macho and the, what was going on with guys like that going around shooting off guns and killing elephants and hunting. All this kind of stuff. So, I think the conversation about The Other Side of the Wind will probably keep going for a long time. And like all of Wells' films, it's released. There's a little bit of a conversation at the time it's released. And then 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, we turn around and say, actually, this is a really great film. That's happened with Touch of Evil. Nobody really rated that in the United States, certainly at the time it was released. And then now it's totally established as an all-time classic. Same with Chimes at Midnight. It's only in recent years people have acknowledged, oh no, this is one of his great films. F for Fake, I think, is the same. And at the time of release, nobody paid a great deal of attention to them. So I think The Other Side of the Wind will be like that as well.
I hope so. And I must admit, I've not seen it since that one viewing in the cinema. So I'd like to
you need to see it again. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Even at the time, I felt like, okay, this is a lot to take in.
And I will give credit to the editor who put this together. That it's certainly true of Wells in this period that he didn't make too many allowances for the ability of the audience to get everything on a first viewing. F for Fake's a bit like that. It's very, very complicated in its editing, and you miss so much on a first viewing. And to the credit of the Other Side of the Wind reconstructors, they kind of followed Wells' cue, and they didn't make too many allowances. There's lots of characters in The Other Side of the Wind. There's all these relationships going on, and you kind of have to just figure it out on the fly. And trust me, the second, third time you watch it, you suddenly realize how it all connects together, and it's much more enjoyable. I think the third time, maybe, or the fourth. But not everybody has time to watch these films on repeat, but I do think they're very rewarding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I used to watch films. I used to get video cassettes from the local garage, and I would watch them with my family or with my friends, and then I would watch them in the morning before taking them back, and I'd always rewatch films. Nowadays there's just so much available out there.
Yeah.
I feel like if I'm rewatching something, I'm missing something else. So it's a new malaise. Right, you have a recommended film book for us, and I think this relates to what we've been talking about. So what is it, Matt? What's your recommended film book?
Well, it's called Orson Welles and Roger Hill, A Friendship in 3 Acts, and it's edited by Todd Tarbox. And this is, there's a lot of Orson Welles books out there, as you know, and as you said, I wrote one of them. But this is a different kind of book.
The best one. The best one.
I don't know.
Well, according to the introduction.
But this particular book, the Welles and Roger Hill book, it's a transcription of conversations these two guys had in the last couple of years of Welles' life. Roger Hill was Orson's headmaster at school, and then they became lifelong friends. So one of his very oldest friends, and there are several books of these transcribed conversations, but I quite like this one because there's a sort of the friendship that these two men have is clearly runs very deep, and it's less sensationalist than the My Lunches with Orson book. But yeah, so I recommend this book because there's no better conversationalist than Orson Welles.
Absolutely. I've never read that. I knew about Roger Hill from the various biographies, but I will definitely try and search that one out. Okay, Matt, listen, thanks so much for spending time with us and talking to us about Mosby Confidential, your book on night moves, and the Orson Welles book, which has a long title that
Just call it the Orson Welles book.
The Orson Welles book. Okay, I'll definitely put the title in my roundup at the end of the podcast and in the show notes. So once again, thanks very much, Matt.
No, my pleasure, John. Thanks. Great to talk to you.
Okay, that was my conversation with Matthew Asprey, who I called Matt all the way through there because we're good mates after that conversation, I guess. The title of the Orson Welles book, the full title of the Orson Welles book was At the End of the Street in the Shadow, Orson Welles and the City. His book about Alan Sharp, Arthur Penn, Gene Hackman and Night Moves is called Mosby Confidential, Arthur Penn's Night Moves and the Rise of the Neo-Noir. And both of those books come highly recommended. And his recommended film book was Conversations between Orson Welles and Rich Hall, I want to say, the name of his headmaster at school. I can't remember it exactly now. Okay, wait a second, I'm going to stop the recording and then look it up. No, it was called Orson Welles and Roger Hill, A Friendship in 3 Acts. Okay, so that's the recommended book. Thanks go to Ellie Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood, who helps out with the art. Thank you also all for listening, and until next week, please take care.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.